This is a presentation about African pottery and a specific kind of African pottery. I would say one way to describe it is that they are spherical in form for the most part, that the body of the pot is either a sphere or an elongated sphere. The other way to look at it is that this work is generated from generations of need. It comes from year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation of needing pots to fulfill very specific functions, and not just wanting a functional pot, but needing a functional pot, so that these cultures, these tribes, have developed these forms and handed them down mother to daughter throughout generations, learning how to improve and innovate the form so that it meets first and foremost the functions that they need to meet in order to survive and thrive. And then it also has a growth in its aesthetic qualities as well. So you can get a sense when you see these pots being carried on the head with such ease and grace that these are pots that they're very familiar with, that they handle these, move them, carry them for their intended purpose. A lot of these pots are generated for water carrying and storage. So that's what you're seeing when you see this very beautiful and graceful kind of movement through the body. And these pots are ubiquitous and important throughout the culture. So in this case, you see them carrying pots to market in Garua, North Cameroon. And here what you see is a potter from Burkina Faso of the Bobo peoples. This is Western Africa, where a lot of these great pots come from. And the other thing you can see is that the potters are primarily female. The women are mostly the potters, with very few exceptions. Some tribes have certain content or certain shapes or forms that they do not want the women to make, that they have male potters to deal with things like figurative imagery. But that is a rare occurrence. There are very few male potters. Almost all of it is female pottery. Here you can see a potter burnishing her large form. The texture that you see in the upper half of the pot, this upside down pot, is by roulade, and that's a round cylinder that has a pattern carved into it, and then that is rolled around the pot to make a repetitive pattern on the piece. And here she is burnishing the bottom of the pot using stones. You can see some of them at her feet there. These are burnishing stones, and what she's doing is she's pushing the grog, the coarse aggregate in the clay, below the surface of the pot, pushing it into the pot, and then the rubbing burnishes and polishes the clay molecules to make a tight and polished surface. And aesthetically it makes it shiny and smooth, but functionally it actually increases its waterproof, its water containing abilities, and this is a water pot. Here you see another technique where the potter is using a bisque piece of pottery to form the new pots. So in this case the bisque pot is held inside the pot, and that helps ensure a continuity of scale, of form, and of a kind of symmetry. When she gets to a certain stage where the pot is no longer where it's getting narrower and narrower, then she'll remove that and finish the pot. Here again an example of coil building by a woman potter from the Republic of Mali. And you can see here and everywhere that we see these people working, you see again the overlapping of the wiping marks of her thumb. How you can see, if you look carefully, the kind of rhythmic marking of the wiping of the inside and out of the pot. And you can also see that she's working, as she works the ring of the pot, she moves around the pot. Rather than having the pot turn, she is actually turning around the pot. You can see her footprints in the sand there. The other thing that you will note is that there's a finished piece in the background that you can see. In this marvelous picture here from Burundi, you see these 4 women, and they are carrying the pots on their head, and you can see the kind of ease in their posture. This is something, a daily activity, whether it's to transport food, grain, or water. And you can, I'm not familiar with that kind of bladder-shaped or kidney-shaped pot. I've never seen one of those except for in this photo. But you can see, again, this idea that these are pots that are very much functional and useful. And this is where their shape, their form, their textures, everything is dictated by this generations of need within the culture. Here is an example of another innovative way to carry pottery. And when you see something like this, what you're looking at is something that's developed, again, over generations as a way to transport these pots. Marvelous to our eyes, and a very common sense solution, perhaps, to their own. Here's another wonderful transportation photograph. Pots to market. Burkina Faso is the location, and this bro is definitely got his work cut out for him as he carries these pieces to market. So now we'll look at some of these forms. Here is a piece from the Nupe people of Nigeria. It's a water jar, and you can see in this design that there is no neck. It goes from the sphere and opening up at the top into a lip, and it's done. And some beautiful applique and impressions, kind of etching and impressions into the clay. This area here that you see where it's raised, and here, those are done by placing coils and then marking them with a tool in a very regular fashion. Here, another marvelous piece. You can see these kind of undulating comb patterns, and then a stippling, some applique, some more comb. Really beautiful rhythmic design here, covering the whole pot. And these, when you're in the lower hemisphere of the piece, that does help. These kinds of marks do help in helping create friction, so they're more easily held when transporting moving water. Again, a water jar. From the Nupe people of Nigeria, these big, beautiful spherical pots. Here's another example of the roulade technique. All of these patterns produced by round cylinders with textures on them that are repeated as the piece is rolled over. This is a water or beer pot. We'll see some more beer pots from the Tula people of Nigeria. And this is a brewing vessel, something used to ferment beer, from Zimbabwe. Here's a beer pot from Nigeria, and we'll see a couple of things here. The beer is drunk often in a communal setting where 5 or more people will sit around a pot filled with beer, and they have long straws as long as 5 feet, 4 to 5 feet, where they're drinking the beer through the straw as they all sit together out of one pot. In this piece, you'll see these bumps and this very dramatic kind of triangle. And how they're done is that first there's a little impression made into the clay, a dimple, and then the clay is pushed in to kind of help control that it stays in its round form. And here, the Republic of Mali, Bamana peoples with another water jar. And what you can see here is, again, the texture at the lower half to help handholds, a non-slipping grip. And then here, what you have is a applique of a lizard pattern. And that lizard is, in some cultures, representing this idea of regeneration. The fact that the lizard loses a tail and it grows back is what you're seeing in this piece here. Here's another example. Also, this is from the Bamana peoples from the Republic of Mali, and you can see again another water container. The necks. This is a little narrower neck, which will reduce spillage, but still has great access. It doesn't get too narrow. When the neck gets too narrow, it starts to lose function, becomes more of a spirit pot or an altar, a pot to be used at the altar. Here you can see snakes and lizards as the applique on theme here. From Nigeria, the Nupe people again, another water jar with roulade techniques and some impressions made from a tool. And you can see a narrow, the narrowing to the neck, nice shoulder form, and then a little bit of a neck before the lip is formed. Here is an example of an altar pot from Nigeria. This piece is from the Bene peoples, and this is a spirit vessel or a piece that is used at an altar. And here is another beer pot. You can see that technique again. The term for it is the amasumba technique. And again, you make a dimple impression, and then you can see that then little balls of clay are put on there. It's a beer pot. Here is the Republic of Mali from the Bamana peoples, and the water container here is used here. You can see again images of both lizards and spiders in this one, and a much wider open neck, and the lip is almost as wide as the body of the pot. Here, this is a piece from Nigeria. The technique that's done here is sgraffito through a terracotta. There's a surface put on of kind of a terra sigillata or a slip, and then it's scratched through. The potter is Ladi Kawali, and Ladi Kawali was active. She worked from she was born in 1925 and she died in 1984, and she was one of the first potters to achieve recognition internationally for her ceramic art. And you can see that they have these very symmetrical full forms with quite a lot of patterning on them. I don't know the origins of this piece. It's quite compelling. It has an animal skin attached to it from underneath. I'd be interested in knowing where it comes from. I've found evidence of it online, but I haven't found certified where I could really figure out where it's coming from. I would guess maybe Nigeria, maybe the Nupe people, though those handles are relatively new. Here is the Igbo people from Nigeria, and a ceremonial vessel where you can see is making great use of applique. Don't know the origins of this pot. This one is from Uganda, and it's a water bottle. This is from Nigeria, a ceremonial vessel with that very compelling, very loose spiral pattern. And then this piece is another water bottle from the Mangbetu people out of Zaire. Here is a water pitcher from the Nupe people, this double form here. And again, lots of surface texture, which will aid in handling and also adds to the beauty of the piece. And then here is another altar piece from Burkina Faso. Again, a lot of pottery coming out of Burkina Faso. The Gur-speaking people, possibly the Lobi. And it's an altar vessel. Again, a spirit vessel, altar vessel. Another altar vessel or ceremonial vessel from the Luba people out of the Republic of Congo. And here you can see a human head also, as in the previous one. And you can see that here in this Nigerian Gaanda spirit or altar vessel pot. Again, the human form. This could have very well been made by a male potter. Many cultures, as I said, prefer that or mandate that females do not make human forms. The Republic of Congo, from the Mangbetu people, here's a water jar. And again, remarkable head. It looks very much like the Nefertiti sculpture out of Egypt. But what gives it that wonderful form up top is a reflection of hairstyle of a hair shape or hair coiffure of the time. You can see in the back, if you look, there's a handle for this to be a water pitcher. So now we're going to make a transition. I want to talk about one specific African potter because he really represents almost a Western approach, and I think probably reflecting more tourism responses and what people were coming to looking for and wanting to buy that informed his work. Voyagna was active from the 1895 to 1928. He was a male potter. And of the Woyo of Zaire, the Woyo people, and his village had one potter, only one potter ever. It was him, and that's the village of Muba, and strangely enough, so he worked. He made standing figures on small pots, or sometimes he made equestrian figures on pots. They were not used for anything. They were not distributed in Africa. They were not sold in Africa. The culture of the Woyo people didn't make pottery. They bought pottery from others. But here was this one potter, Voyagna, who got interested in making pottery and sold it very successfully. And it's represented not in Africa, but in Europe and America. And he's really functioning like, in a sense, he's a great transition to Western pottery. I want to scroll back a little bit and look at some of these forms we have been looking at, which really do form the fullness of our interest of what we're working on. We're working on making some of these big, round, beautiful forms and these spherical pots. And what I want to talk about is Voyagna's example and what he's doing and why I refer to it as Western. There's an important concept here. One of the big lessons we get from spending this time focusing on and admiring and learning about and actually emulating the African spherical pottery is we learn about a pottery tradition which grew from a culture out of need, out of necessity, and whose forms, the functionality of those forms were improved, the appearance of those forms were refined generation after generation, and it's a certain kind of feeling in relationship to this pottery as opposed to what you experience from Western art. Also equally wonderful, inspiring, but a lot of the functionality of Western art has been moved away from out of the art. It's a bit of an art for art's sake. Even in our functional pottery in America, and in the West, we love it. We prefer it oftentimes to the various things that have replaced it, like Tupperware, Corningware, Revereware, all steel and plastic. All these things that are much more convenient have replaced much of what we used to do with pottery. But people still enjoy using pottery, but even so, there is a difference between a preference for function and a need for function that is reinforced generation after generation. And I hope you can experience this and see this both in looking at the films that I've provided and on these pictures, but also in the experience of making these pieces. Just contemplate it, because they're both such wonderful and viable aesthetics, and they're both wonderful and viable creative expression, and they just come from very different orientations. And here's a little bit I want to read you at this point from a book called Smashing Pots, Work of Clay from Africa by Nigel Barley. And here, just a couple of paragraphs here, he says, "The West has long maintained a distinction between art, characterized by obsessive individual innovation, and craft, characterized by self-effacing constraint within a tradition. By such measures, African potters are eminently craftswomen persons, being born to the task within a cultural tradition. Indeed, skills are frequently passed down from mother to daughter, according to a principle that any deviation from convention is a mistake and makes a pot wrong. As a Duwewo potter once expressed it, you do not want your children to be like other people's children. You do not want them to be unlike other people's children. They should be the same, but better. So it is with pots." So a good pot is thus a good rendition of an already received design, but it should not be thought that this means that correct pots are not criticized. Even pots of accepted form will be turned and examined. The sound they make when struck will be noted. The decoration will be declared good or bad, too deep or too shallow. This is typical not simply of material objects, but also of the oral literatures of some cultures. The greatest approbation may be reserved not, as in the West, for superficial novelty, but rather for the best performance of a story that is already well known. And here in this descriptor, you can hear the bias a little bit when they're saying, well, the West only wants superficial novelty. Not necessarily an accurate description. The West's contemporary art is constantly striving for innovation and new inspiration and insights never before thought of, perhaps. That's a different approach. But in this approach, I love that idea that it's like a child. You want your child to be like everybody else's, only better. So you get a sense of this concept. It's a powerful concept that you can work within a tradition and still innovate, still express yourself creatively. So that's a little bit of what we're experiencing when we look at this African pottery. So I'm going to scroll very quickly back to where we were when we were looking at the figures and the equestrian figure here of Voanya. So we look at these pieces, and then we're ready to move into the West. And Magdalena Adundo is also a fantastic transition concept here, because she's a British citizen of African descent, and she is a fabulous potter, one of indeed the most successful potters in England, and she works very carefully and slowly. It may take her as much as a month to make a piece, and they're even, thin, precise, carefully hand coiled from scratch to create these pieces that are perfectly smooth and symmetrical, all by hand. And she does talk about working from her roots and African tradition, but you can see that she has almost an architectural or clearly sculptural idea. Everything from the shoulder up. tends to start being a little bit more asymmetrical and designed. But you can see here in a piece like this that there's the echo of the human head pots with the great hairdos. You can see that in a sort of abstract sense there. It's another example. Going a little fast here. Let's see if I can get back here just to show you. They really are remarkable pieces. And you can see that she has a general concept of a very stable visual and structural symmetrical base, followed by a more sculptural finish and a lot of experimentation. So very much a Western approach to the work. Now we're going to look at a few other potters working in large-scale coil pottery. This one, I don't think that the white crackle glaze really manages to serve this pot well, and I think this lip is a little uneventful and frail here. Proportion-wise, this doesn't work for me, but I do think it's a great example of the faceting technique that I described for you in the technique demonstrations. Here is another artist, a favorite of mine, Wendy Herrera, who is working on large scale, quite large, coil built pottery. This piece is about 3.5 feet tall, perhaps. And you can see here, these are quite large. You'll get a sense of their scale further on. But coil built and symmetrical at the bottom, and then by the time she gets to the beginning of the shoulder, she starts to create an asymmetrical undulation, returning to a very centered and controlled form at the finish from the neck up. So all the action is in the shoulder. Get a sense of their scale here. And here are some examples of pots I've made in previous demonstrations. On the right is an example of the incise and snap technique. In the center is a piece that is, as it was still leather hard, I gouged and scraped in the bottom half of the sphere here, lots of lines and gouges, and then painted over the whole thing with white slip, and then took my metal rib and scraped it so that the white slip only remained in the gouges. To the left, you can see a great example of faceting, the faceting technique. We'll look at those. Here's another incise and snap technique. And again, you'll see these techniques demonstrated. It's fairly simple. The hardest part is when it's still quite soft, you need to take a wooden tool with a little bit of width, and you incise the clay going in about 1/3 to 1/2 of the depth of the pot. If you go too deep, the pot's going to crack. So you make these parallel lines, and I've gotten to the point where I just hand do them by eye. And then once it's leather hard or bone dry, I snap the pieces off to create this jagged texture. Here again, the faceting, you'll see how I do this with a broken hacksaw blade. There's a demonstration of doing this on a horizontal facet rather than a diagonal vertical facet here. And off the left there, you can see an example of one of my sort of contemporary face jugs that we'll talk more about as we get to that section. Here again is the sgraffito, no, it's not the sgraffito, I'm sorry, it's called mishima. Sgraffito is where you scratch through a slip surface. This is mishima, where you make gouges, or you can push in little patterns and prints, draw things in there, and then paint slip into it and scrape it clean off the surface so it just stays in your gouges there. Here are a couple of student projects. This is by Joe, I think Senga is his last name, or Senka. And Joe is very exuberant and enthusiastic in this, so he's made this big spherical pot, and he felt a strong need to express it this way, with this mushroom cloud on the head and this big bulging-eyed face in it. And here's another face version here by Lily of an African pot, and she came up with the 3-footed foundation to the piece as well. And finally, here are some photographs of the pieces being fired. They're field fired quite often. We're going to do something very similar with your pots. We're going to pit fire them, which is like a field firing, only it's in a hole in the ground. Here the pieces are put on top of fuel, and then they're covered with fuel, and then it's lit on fire. This is an example of a tradition where they fire one pot at a time. And you can see them covering the pot with fuel. Here's a much larger project here. Again, you can see them all placed, built very much stacked and leaned on each other in a big dome of pottery. And then it will be covered with grasses and lit on fire, as you can see here. So that's a bit of a journey into African pottery. And so the big sphere of African pottery is, the big spherical African pottery is what we're working on in this section.